Today we have the Lucas Award. First question you might ask, why Lucas, especially the younger colleagues here present? Peter Lucas was the chair of the board of FME, the chairman that established FME as a free and independent organization. Unfortunately, lost him a few years ago, and the prize for the highly influential paper is named after him as homage to him. So, how is this paper chosen? We have an awards committee, and the awards committee works very hard to identify a paper that's been published in any of the symposia, even before the symposia were actually being called FM. And they go through all the papers, analyzing their impact, and decide on a winner. We are extremely grateful for their work and their recommendation. Here are the members of the awards committee, some of which are here at the audience. Thank you so much on behalf of FME for your hard work. But it's now time that I can reveal to you what is the winner of the Lucas Award 2019. And here it is. It's a paper by colleagues Paul Siverson and Stuart Stubblebine. Paul Siverson's here with us today, and he will give us a talk about the work and about the consequences of that work. The paper is called Group Principles and the Formalization of Anonymity, and quite fitting, it was published in the first World Congress on Formal Methods. So it's extremely pleasing that 20 years later, here we are to recognize the influence of this paper. Before I ask Paul to come and talk to you about the paper, I'd like to describe to you the reasons that were given to the board as to why this paper was selected. So, we have been told, in this paper, the authors introduce a reasoning approach for anonymity protocols and anonymity services. The goal of these protocols is to hide some fact about a principle or set of principles from an adversary. The authors developed an epistemic language and associated logic for describing and reasoning about an adversary's view of a set of suspected adversaries. The work is widely applicable and has been useful for characterizing security properties relating to anonymity and privacy. It is especially important for users of electronic commerce, where many protocols have emerged for protecting the anonymity of individual users, general internet communications, commercial transactions, web-based communications, email and electronic cash. The contribution is informally representing and analyzing privacy in their protocols. Their epistemic characterization of anonymity properties was entirely novel. Epistemic logic today is one of just 3 different frameworks for analyzing anonymity. The work in this paper established that certain security specifications, such as anonymity and authentication, are most appropriately expressed in terms of the knowledge, or lack of it, of protocol participants and intruders. These security properties are not easily expressed in terms of events that did or did not happen along a single run of the protocol. Instead, they are perhaps best articulated in terms of the knowledge and beliefs of the participants. For this reason, the authors, following early work on Ban logic, chose epistemic logic as their specification language. Epistemic logic is the logic of knowledge and belief, and by providing a way of modeling complicated scenarios involving groups of agents, it provides insight into the properties of individual agents who know facts in a security-sensitive context. An important consequence of this paper's foundational work is that it has contributed to other well-founded theoretical approaches employing epistemic logic in a security setting. In parallel, there has been considerable progress in efficiently solving the model checking problem for temporal epistemic logics. This has enabled the development of symbolic model checking toolkits based on temporal epistemic formalisms and optimized for the verification of security protocols. Now, we see a variety of specification approaches and their mechanization. Since an anonymity protocol attempts to preserve secrecy by distributing the data over a wide area, the assumptions made about the capacities of an attacker are very relevant. A ubiquitous attacker will be able to break most anonymity protocols. But ubiquity is not always a very realistic assumption. However, attackers who reside only at a single node and do not communicate with each other are not very realistic either. So the authors deal with some aspects of this problem, introducing a key notion of group principle, whose group consists of members who are assumed to have certain specific capacities for sharing knowledge. The paper has been widely cited and is an important contribution to the theory and practice of formal methods in a significant application area that is of increasing importance to our society, security. For all these reasons, we give you Paul Siverson, here present today, and Stuart Stubblebine, so winners of the FME Lucas Award 2019. Congratulations. And I invite Stefania to present Paul with the certificate for his award.
This is for you. Thank you.
Congratulations, Paul. Thank you very much for being here. The floor is yours. I have to take this away for you.
Oops. Perfect. No. So, but
Which one?
I think so I can move around.
Okay,
Yeah.
sure.
So, hi. First of all, thank you. I'm unduly, I think, honored by this. When they told me that I won this award, I thought, oh, great. I'll have to find my slides. And I did go and find my transparencies, and I brought them, but, okay, so that's actually a lie. I did find the transparencies, but they're heavy, and so I didn't bring them on the plane. But back then, PowerPoint existed, but wasn't reliable, so somebody, what am I doing? Do I need to hold closer or something? I just haven't plugged in yet. That's okay. Just give it a minute. I checked this just before the talk, so that's why sometimes unplug there and replug. Yeah, there you go. There we go. It's going to happen because it's acting. No problem. Now I just find the arrow, which is tiny on my screen. There we go. I got it. So everybody's trying to help the old man. Where's the slides? Okay, so this is a paper that I wrote with my then colleague, Stuart Stubblebine. As I said, I didn't bring my slides, but I did. This is one of the slides from the original. I'll come back to this, but I did have them. So first off, I want to say we're sort of a little the group here for Formal Methods 2019 to be talking about this. One, I don't know if this was the absolute last paper, but Stuart went off into private industry, and this was either the last or close to the last research thing he published before he kind of went off and did other things. Now, when we wrote this paper, I had been working on formal analysis of authentication protocols and other security protocols for probably a decade-ish. And then I went off and I started working on anonymous communication, onion routing, and so this seemed like a natural way to be combining those two things. But it was also increasingly, I was working exclusively on that, and so I have not actually done a lot of logical work since this paper. I went back and actually was looking at my publications since then, and I did have one survey paper that came out in 2000, and I had another. I published a book on logic and common knowledge and such shortly thereafter, but it was actually work that was mostly done, finished by the early 90s. It just takes a long time to get a book published. So you might say, who are these guys if they're not actually working on the stuff anymore? But we're both exonerated, and it's a bit worse than that, because we're not alone. To a large extent, everybody else kind of stopped working on epistemic logics for security protocol verification. Now, that's a slight overstatement, and I'll get into it, but I'll come back to that. But first, I wanted to, I'll say a little bit about some of the things that I'll touch on. So one, this was, I think, the start of trying to think about how to formalize onion routing, which I've been working on since then. Onion routing and Tor. I didn't think to bring business cards with me, but as always, I brought some Tor stickers if anybody wants one. Before, this was my first sort of foray into trying to get rigorous about that, because well, as you see, it's sort of tricky because, as was alluded to in the opening remarks, you can't just assume an adversary is everywhere, but trying to characterize exactly where he sits is hard. This was also our start of sort of thinking epistemically about anonymous communications. Prior to that, I mean, there was a general notion of hiding, but trying to think about it in epistemic terms, I don't think was done, and I'll show how that came in. And lastly, I think in many ways, some of the most useful things was in helping us just figure out how to think about anonymity. If you were at the keynote this morning, there were comments made about how it was important to essentially get students thinking, understanding the concepts was more important on some level, at least as a first step, than, I mean, ultimately you want them to be able to use the tools, but if they don't have a concept, then they're just sort of doing it cookbook style. So, I'm going to now just quickly go through what was going on in this paper, and start with this little background. So at the time, I guess, starting in 1988, Burroughs, Abadi, and Needham had this band logic, and then there followed a whole pile of these eponymous logics, Gong, Needham, and Yahalom, and Abadi, Tuttle, and Syverson, and Van Oorschot, that was me. And anyway, so here I just wrote down one of the sort of standard rules that band logic had. So if Alice believes that she's received, and that notation meant a message X that says it's from B, and it's encrypted under symmetric key K, and if Alice believes that that's a good key for Alice and Bob to talk to one another, then you can conclude that Alice believes that Bob said X. So basically, if she sees an encrypted message from X, an encrypted message from Bob, and she thinks it's encrypted under a good key, then she could believe that Bob said it. And they used rules like this to go through protocols and identify a lot of times flaws in fairly simple protocols where I didn't write down a freshness rule, but where either some message could be replayed or it's actually from somebody else, and using the logics allowed you to uncover that. There was also work that used epistemic formalisms to reason about multi-level security properties. So in this example, this was from, I guess, Glasgow, McEwen, and Penangaden. So if like a low-level part of the system, say if low knows that phi, then low is permitted to know that phi. And there were other characterizations of, I had one where we showed probabilistic non-interference, where essentially if the probability of an output to low was a certain value, then low had to know in advance that probability was that value. And then it satisfied non-interference. Jose Messiker's here. He introduced the concept in 1982. Is that? I think 1982. Anyway, these were the sorts of logics we were using, and then there was some work around also about looking at things epistemically, primarily from Joe Halpern and many various colleagues. They had a book that came out in '95, and they looked at things like the muddy children problem, which is a classic sort of distributed knowledge example. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but the idea is you have a bunch of children and they have mud on their faces, and you don't know if you have mud on your face or not because it's on your face. And the interlocutor can say, do you know if you have mud on your face? And after enough times of everybody saying no, then you can properly infer that you do have mud on your face, even though you can't see it. And I'm not going to go through that, but this is an example of what they call a knowledge program, which was basically intended to be effectively an executable, hopefully, specification of the problem in epistemic terms. So if one of the kids hears the question and knows that, so if they know they have mud on their face, then they can say yes. And anyway, I'm not going to walk through it because I'll say it wrong or something. But this was what they call the knowledge program, and we were hoping to make use of these in this context. I don't think, in the interest of time, I'm going to go through the details of the system model. It's not crucial for this. I'm going to go through a worked example that I had in the paper, which is much easier now that I've scanned these all into PowerPoint, because way back when I had to do this by layering slides on top of each other, multiple slides, and taking them off and shifting them around. And anyway, you'll see. So the idea was there was a bunch of Americans, and they're sitting around at a restaurant at FM 99 there, and they want to order a pizza. And the important question, let's assume they were, say, from New York, so the big fight is always, do you get anchovies or not? Because people either love them or hate them. So they could solve this by each ordering crepe, because they're in France, but anchovies on crepe, no, not so good. So they could try to get it on half or something like that, but the restaurant, let's assume, isn't going to go for that. So the question is, do they want to order it or not? So I can't speak French, but I could write it at this baby level. So and it was Toulouse. So let's assume that one of them says, I want anchovies. We had these different notions of groups. So one would be and group, and this is the same as Fagan et al. Had, which is just to say all the principles in the group either do an action or know something. So in this case, even though this principle said that they want anchovies, the and group hasn't actually said that they want anchovies, nor does it know that because not everyone has. And then we also had the notion of a collective group, which is also from in their stuff, they called it a distributed group or collective knowledge. But we did have one of the first different things we had was the notion of an OR group, which is not, I think, in around previously. And this basically says that, one or possibly others, but one or another of the principles has said something. This is more useful as a construction for, actually, let me just go right to that, to this notion that we introduced, which was what we called a threshold group. So here, the threshold is, say, 3, and what a threshold group is an OR group made up of group principals, and each one of those group principals is itself comprised of at least n members of the group. So so this would be an n out of g threshold group. So in this example, if at least 3 of them said anchovies, then they wanted anchovies, then the n group would have said that, or excuse me, the threshold group would have said that and would know it. And the collective group would also have known it. But importantly, we wanted to allow that they're not necessarily saying these things publicly. This might be encrypted so that each one of those S1s is effectively a share of theirs to try to express what they're saying. So you think of it as encrypted. And this came from our motivation from threshold cryptography. So this has a couple different flavors. One is secret sharing, where if enough members of a group have contribute their shares, then they're able to recover a secret. Whereas in threshold crypto, you can operate directly on a message, so you don't have to reassemble the secret. If each of several people have the message, they can put their share in and create the encrypted message without having to combine them. And this was the basic idea of a threshold, and that we wanted to apply. So now, how do we put this all in? Oh, I probably should have said right at the beginning. If anybody has questions, or if you want any kind of explanations or anything, please feel free to ask. I realized, for example, I had this example of a band logic rule, but I didn't include an example of a simple protocol. I don't have one, but if you have questions about that or anything else, please feel free to interrupt. The anonymity properties we had in mind is mostly the idea of hiding something from intruders. So in this case, you might not want the intruder to know that a particular individual was the kind of person who wants anchovies. So possible intruders could be just everybody else in the group who's not you. It could be different size threshold groups or collective groups. You could combine these with, say, the waiter or the chef. And then, depending on who the intruder is, we had different notions of anonymity. So the simplest notion would be what's called possible anonymity, where the intruder considers it possible that Jay said they want anchovies or didn't. But you could also express many other properties. You could have the idea that J is effectively suspected if at level n, if the intruder knows that J, but possibly n minus 1 others said it. And the complement to that could be, this is what, we actually changed this in the paper. There's a notion of K anonymity, which is often used in the privacy literature. And people had just published that, and we actually had K here in the paper, and then we changed it to N because we didn't want anybody to think we were stealing their idea or something. But it's the same basic idea that essentially the intruder considers it possible that any one of K might have said that. And then you could also do some, more logically complex notions, such as if the intruder thinks it's possible that J said they want anchovies, then the intruder also has to think at least, and others did. So it's a way of not just being, can be conditionally anonymous. So these were the ideas we had. There was some worked analyses in the paper, but I'm, in the interest of time, I'm going to sort of skip over that. And, oh wait, I'm ahead of myself. It's hard for me to see what I'm doing next. So, oh yeah, okay. So this is an example of a knowledge program that I was talking about. In our formalism, the Nobody talks directly to anybody else. They always talk through the environment, so we specified environment principles. These were two examples. In the first case, the environment is just reliably forwarding. If I is sending a message to J, it gets there. And in the second case, the environment doesn't forward the message, but also keeps track of it. So this would be presumably more of an adversary. So the environment might be one of these adversarial principles. And again, this is using these knowledge programs, which I don't think, in the long run, I don't think people really use these. This was one of the things we were kind of hoping might sort of become useful for actually specifying, but I'll come back to that. So in the paper, we set out basic constructs and a system and a logic for reasoning about group principles, and we did specify a very simple anonymizer system, and I'll come to that in a second. Now, we had a lot of plans. We planned to work much more elaborate examples. We thought it important to add temporal reasoning, and one of the elements there was we were thinking of adding proactive security. So I already talked about threshold information. There's a notion of proactive security is when you can sort of share a secret, but then an issue might be, what if the adversary gradually compromises principles? And that can be okay as long as the system in general has some healing or updating process. Maybe you get new shares of your keys every once in a while. And a proactively secure secret sharing scheme allows principals to update their keys so that they can still reconstruct the same secret, but the shares after the update are not combinable with the shares in the previously. So that seemed like a useful thing to do. Also, we had planned to put in a model theoretic semantics for this, possibly an operational semantics, again, to facilitate possibly using model checking, things like that, and automation, and we never got to any of that. So now I thought I would say a little bit about what happened in epistemic logic for reasoning about security protocols and where things went there. So as I said, the first big thing was Burroughs, Abadi, and Needham's logic, which I think the first version was in 1988. They published a bunch of different ones, and I gave you the example earlier of the rules. So this had a lot of successes. They analyzed a ton of protocols. They found a lot of uneven protocols that had been rigorously looked at before, and they found a lot of attacks on them. But they were mostly hand analyses of small protocols. Remember, Roger Needham once said to me that he thought the real virtue of BAN was not the proofs that they enabled, but that if you had a PhD in computer science and you asked him to stare at a 5 or 10 line program for a month and get close to it and see what might be wrong with it, he'd tell you to stick it. But if you said, oh, please formalize it in this system, that they would be fine with that, and then they would get so familiar with the different ways that the protocol might have problems that they could figure that out. Although I do think the process of actually trying to represent the beliefs was a big chunk of that. So there were, I don't want to overstate, there were some automated verifications of some pretty complex protocols. Sven Dietrich did one of SSL back then, and I forget what he used, but Steve Bracken used HOL and looked at some significant e-commerce protocols. But notice that both of these actually predated this paper. So there seemed to be a lot of sort of promise for formal verification, but of using epistemic logics, but to a large extent that didn't transpire. And I think that's because, partly, it's because epistemic formalisms are really good for helping people to understand on a fairly intuitive level features of the protocol. I mean, if you can say things like, oh, this principle knows these things, and we can reason through and show, what they can infer and can't, that's got a fairly intuitive conceptual appeal to it and usefulness in leading to understanding. But I was wondering why we didn't see this development of large-scale verification and stuff. And I've asked a couple people about this. I talked to Martina Botti, and I talked to my boss, Kathy Meadows, who still does a lot of formal work. She did NRL Protocol Analyzer and still works on it, now called MAUD NPA. But I think one of the things that we all seemed somewhat to think might be relevant is that this is really useful intuitive formalisms, but then there's somewhat different ways that people tend to specify protocols. And getting the abstraction to map down to that, I'm not saying, I think in principle there's no reason you shouldn't be able to do that, but either it seemed harder than using, say, process algebras and other things that people did go on to do a lot of formal verification with, or possibly nobody just did that detailed work. Now, interestingly, a lot of these people said, like, oh yeah, but you can't handle certain cryptographic issues like XOR or Diffie-Hellman, and I looked and I said, wait a minute, we did do that. I had a logic where we introduced those things, but I think while we had them in there abstractly, there's still, and I was talking to Jose about this at breakfast this morning, that all these formal analysis techniques had these issues, but for some of them, like in MAUD, they worked very hard to figure out how that actually interacted with the formalism on a sort of deep level. And I think that enabled them to match up with it in a way that so far hasn't happened with the epistemic stuff. Now, so far I'm sounded kind of negative about everything, but I do think we had some successes. So, as I said, in the paper we formalized a one-hop anonymizing proxy. But we didn't analyze it, we just formalized it. And this paper led to some further developments by Halpern and O'Neill. They formalized another protocol called Dining Cryptographers, and then Vandermaiden and Su showed that they could do symbolic model checking analysis of Dining Cryptographers. Now, just how many people know what Dining Cryptographers even is? That's what I thought. So, fortunately, I'm going to give you a couple quick examples. So, one-hop anonymizing proxy, this is pretty straightforward. So let's suppose Alice wants to communicate with Naval Research Lab, and the idea is it just routes through something which strips off anything identifying about her and hides doesn't forward her network location. So an example of this might be a VPN. If you log into a VPN, then when you connect somewhere, typically all the receiving party knows is that you came through the VPN, unless you log in or something. But they can also just be a simple thing that's just publicly available on the internet. I was looking the other day, there's a search engine called Start Page, and they have a little link next to their search results called Anonymous View. And if you click on that, then you're looking at the web page proxy through Start Page. So that's the example of an anonymizing proxy. Dining Cryptographers is a little different. Basic idea was from David Chaum, I think 88, I'm not sure I had that date right. But the idea is there's a bunch of cryptographers and they're out to lunch. This is the story he tells in the paper. And the waiter comes over and says, oh, lunch is paid for. And they're perfectly happy to have one of their friends treat them to lunch. That's okay. And they don't want to out the person who generously did this. But they're concerned, not really sure why, that maybe the NSA bought them lunch. And I would think you'd be happy. But anyway, that's the story. So they try to come up with this protocol to figure out if one of them paid for lunch without knowing who. And the idea is first you set something up so that essentially there's communication between each pair of principals, but the other principal can't see it. So that's what I try to represent with the triangle. So like the guy at the top can't see what's going on between these two. And then what they do is they flip some shared coins that each pair can see, but the third party can't. And they look at these and just note whether the pair of coins they can see are the same or different. This is basic. You need at least 3 to do this, but you can do it for, any number. So far, so good. And then in order to communicate, so here if somebody wants to signal, I paid for lunch, what they do is they just lie. So if this one sees different, the guy at the top, he sees different coins, but he says the same. And if you look at the parity of the whole thing, when you work it out, if the number of ones saying different is odd, then there's a signal, and if it's even, then there's no signal, and presumably the NSA paid for lunch. Interestingly enough, I was once giving a series of courses to a group at NSA, who apparently don't like me talking about this, and I don't know. Anyway, I was giving a series of talks to, I gave a course to a group at NSA, and after I'd been presenting this for a few weeks, and then I went and they took me to lunch. We went out to lunch, and then they said, oh, lunch is paid for. And I said, wait a minute, I'm a government employee. What if a defense contractor or somebody paid for this? I could be in a lot of trouble. But you guys are all government employees. I think it's fine. What can we do? So I had them take out some coins. And we actually used the dining cryptographer's protocol to prove that the NSA paid for my lunch. So I'm not sure if David would be happy about that or not. I haven't asked him. So these are the kinds of things that have been formally analyzed. So we have one-hop proxies. Now these are very simple and trivial, but they're also very weak. If your VPN isn't trusted, and this is documented, there are VPNs out there where they sell who is talking to whom to various parties. They just, they own that data, and they promise not to reveal sometimes, but they reveal anyway. So there's a single point of trust, but it's also a single point of failure. So if an adversary is watching communication coming into start page and out of start page, they don't have to actually see you connecting to the web page to know, oh, here I see a connection from Alice to start page, and then I see, even if it's all encrypted, I see the same pattern of bits going off to, I don't know, I can't think of a good example, but Google. Why anybody wants to hide? Why would somebody going to start page go to Google? But I can't think. Anyway, so they would just see that, and then they would be able to bypass whatever start page is doing. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, we have dining cryptographers networks, like I just described. These people have been able to prove things about, but these have really strong requirements. They have to be globally synchronized. Everybody has to know. They always have to send, and everybody has to be persistently online. You can never go away, and you have to participate in every round, whether you have a message to send or not. Now, there's more complex versions of this that you can use to do things like avoid collisions if, say, 2 people try to send a message at the same time, and also if you have a misbehaving participant, there's complex protocols to try to figure out who that is and remove them. While there has been significant work done to try to make these things practical and scalable, I think the most significant probably from Brian Ford now at Lausanne, but to a first approximation, these are really strong and have very strong requirements, and they're not that useful for general, anonymous internet communication. They just have, they don't have much use. And so we have this kind of dichotomy where epistemic logic seems to be really useful for thinking about the really trivial, weak cases or the really strong cases, but what we would really like is the things in the middle. Now, this may not just be the problem of epistemic logic, it may be the problem that anonymity is hard. We weren't the first to think about formalizing anonymity at all. There was a paper at Azorix 3 years before us, that also formalized anonymity using CSP, and they actually then proved their results using FDR. But they also looked at Dyning cryptographers' networks. So the question is, how can you deal with more significant networks? And so far, knowledge logics have not been able to do that. But this research did lead us to be able to formalize onion routing. So I wanted to just, in a very tight nutshell, I mean, there's a lot of work on onion routing. There's now whole conferences devoted to it, but just very quickly how it works. So the idea is, say, Alice wants to connect to somewhere. In this case, she's going to NRL, and you have a distributed network through which she connects, and by going through multiple hops, somebody can see her connecting to the network, but doesn't know where she's going to, and somebody can see that somebody's connecting to NRL, but doesn't know where it came from. And the basic way that we do this is Alice knows about this whole network. I'm going to hand wave that part right now. The public Tor network right now has about 7,000 relays in it. This is a large-scale thing that people use. There's estimates vary, but daily users between 2 and 8 million users a day of this network. You can just look it up at metrics.torproject.org to get the latest numbers, but I think it's carrying about 200 gigabits a second of application traffic. As I said, there's 70,000 relays out there. Alice's software on her computer knows about the network, and she knows the public keys of all the relays, and so she can use these to do a handshake and establish a session key with the first relay, and then she can tunnel through that and use the public key of R2 to set up a key here. Now, I should point out, because she's using the public key of R2, R1 has no access to this yellow key. So she shares that with R1, but R2, but R1 doesn't know about it. And then she tunnels through that to R5 there. And then once she's built this circuit, now she can start to communicate application data. And it's meant to be application independent. This is one of the reasons so many people use it. As far as Bob is concerned, he's just getting a TCP connection from R5 there. I mean, he doesn't have to know anything about onion routing for this to work. So, and then the traffic can flow in both directions. It just, the keys get applied coming back the other way, and then Alice's Tor client just strips them all off. So that's the very simple, basic onion routing. One thing which is not too directly related here, but I just feel obligated to say, most people always seem to, when they hear about these things, they're always thinking about this as hiding. You're hiding from the destination. First of all, not necessarily from the destination. It's about separating the identification from the routing. In this case, if she's, like if it were me traveling here and I want to connect to NRL, I don't want to be hiding from them. I want not only to be identified, I want to be authenticated. I just don't want that to happen by the bits going along. But usually you have no idea where your bits go when they go around. You can do a trace route, but there's no guarantee that your traffic will even follow the same route the second time. But is actually a picture of an old interface. It's different now. But Alice actually knows not just where her stuff went. It's not just identified. It's cryptographically authenticated. So in a sense, she has a much better authenticated understanding of where her traffic goes than she would ordinarily. But anyway, so that's onion routing in a tight nutshell. And what we were able to do in this paper sort of led to us thinking about how to formalize anonymity in general. And actually, in some sense, it was the limitation, I wouldn't say failures, but the limitation, noticing that anytime there was an attempt to formalize epistemically, people always were looking at these really demanding protocols that with very limited, because they were so restricted, feasibility, like Dining Cryptographers networks. We looked at doing something else. The first thing close was this paper by Mao et al. They called it onion routing, but it was actually, I just showed you how you make a connection through the network and out, but theirs was more like you send a message. It was connectionless, but nonetheless, we built off of their formalisms, and we formalized in 2007, we did a formalization in I/O automata. And we were able to prove very basic properties, such as if the adversary wasn't at a relay that was immediately adjacent to the first relay or otherwise observing them, then they couldn't tell whether or not, and there was at least two people using the network, then they couldn't, say, for example, know that Alice was using the network. So we were able to do things like that. But cryptographers generally aren't used to thinking in those terms. So we also showed that you could abstract from this to a black box model in the universally composable framework, which, if you know what that is, that's nice, and if you don't, I'm not going to take the time to explain it. On the one hand, that's nice because now we were showing this in a fully formal way, not just a rigorous way. Well, what we showed rigorously was that the abstraction at the black box level matched an abstraction of what was going on in the I/O automata, and prove anonymity about that. And then Backus et al. Went on to extend that and so that you could handle things like website fingerprinting, which is the notion that if you can't watch both ends of a connection and therefore figure out who's talking to whom, maybe you can just see the pattern of bits going back and forth, and if you know, oh, this is what the pattern of bits looks like when somebody connects to CNN.com, then you could figure out that that's CNN. And there's a huge literature on the website fingerprinting problem and how to counter it and what to deal with it. And they showed how we could formalize that. And one thing to note also is that all of this stuff looks at the network as a snapshot. Another comment from this morning, here they're talking about formal tools and like, does it work? And by does it work meant, is it actually useful to people? And one of the problems with all of these things is they answer things like 20% of the connections through this network are, compromised given these assumptions. And what good is that to me if I want to use the network? What I want to know is, this is the kind of stuff I do every day, and if I do that, how screwed am I? And so in later work, we looked at things like, well, if you use the network in this way, from what we know of how the network is deployed, it will take this long, the expected time until your first compromised circuit is so long. Or if you're using it in this way, this fraction of your traffic will get compromised over a given period. And these are the kinds of things that would be actually useful to people, but these formalisms don't allow that. So one question might be if we can add temporal reasoning to that. We certainly have added temporal reasoning to our analyses, but not to our formal analyses. So another thing that came from this work, I think, was starting to think about things epistemically. So remember before I said Alice knows about the network? So as I said, there's 7,000 relays in the Tor network, and they have public keys, and then it's not even that, because there's also what are called the exit policies, because not all of the relays exit to the public network, and there's a whole bunch of information. And Tor also has a lot of users that have, old crappy equipment on, bad network connections, and they're not the kind of people where you can say, look, just go buy the latest iPhone or something. Actually, iPhone is a different thing. Go buy the latest Samsung. I'm not going to get into the reason I said that. So there's a problem of if they had to download full information about the whole network on a regular basis to have updated information, that'd be a problem. So you could try to solve this by giving out partial information. There's a couple issues. One is you might be attacked in some way, but suppose you're not. Suppose everything happens just fine and everybody gets clean information, but they're only getting partial information. So issues that can come up is if I only know about some parts of the network, somebody can observe connections through the network and then know if it's, or with higher probability know that it's me. So this was first just observed by Dinezes and Clayton, and then George Dinezes and I did some actual proofs about things like, well, if everybody in the network knows about n nodes, then if the adversary knows a certain number of nodes in a route, then as the fraction of, basically as the network grows, we showed how the adversary knowledge, what it comes to. But we also examined what we called bridging attacks. So one kind of anonymous communication system, which still gets researched a lot, but was used at least somewhat back in the day, was mixes, which basically take in a bunch of messages and then cryptographically change their appearance and send them out in, say, batches. And then anybody watching doesn't know which inbound message went to which outbound message. But you can epistemically bridge the network, because if somebody hops through a bunch of relays as they go through the network and people only know about some parts of the network, then you can start to infer, if Alice knows about this relay, and if I'm, say, the second relay, I can see 3, and I might be able to greatly narrow down who knows what about the network. But I can also use negative knowledge. I could infer, like, if, for example, nobody else sending into a given mix knows about one of the mixes on the other side except for Alice, then I can infer that Alice must be the one who sent to there. So we use this epistemic reasoning to analyze all of this. And again, I think that got started from looking at things in this paper. So as I said, there's been a lot of epistemic analysis of different anonymity concepts, and I think that's where it's actually been most useful, is in getting people to have a more rigorous and in some cases novel and detailed understanding. And I have some examples up here, but I call in particular attention to this last one here, because in voting protocols, there's a concept that was called receipt freeness, which is essentially, another way to phrase it is freedom from rubber hose cryptanalysis. The idea is that suppose if the protocol is such that even if I wanted to prove to the adversary who I voted for, I can't. There's just no way to produce a receipt that will prove who I voted for. And this is an important property against coercion. And it's been around for a while, but these guys recast it in terms of epistemic logic. And the reason I think it was especially interesting was because at the end of their paper, they noted that previous characterizations, in order to explain about indistinguishability of, say, they had to appeal to things like indistinguishability of one voter to another, so they had to talk about multiple parties, where what you really wanted to know is, this guy voted, and does the receipt-free property follow or not? And by casting it in terms of epistemic logic, they were able to just consider if they sent specific messages to, say, a spy, could the spy know how they voted or not. And by recasting it in terms of epistemic logic, they could actually get sort of closer to the protocol formalism than the other ways that have been characterized previously. And that's in kind of contrast to some of the other examples I was talking about earlier, where sometimes that's a harder distance to make. So voting protocols seem like they might be closer to epistemic logics. And that might also be because, sort of similar to dynamic cryptographers, you have a lot of strong assumptions you can make. You know, who's voting is typically, they all have to be registered, you all have to vote at a particular time, and you know, there's all kinds of guarantees in place. Also, it doesn't have to have the real time of, say, looking up something on the web. If it takes a day to calculate the results, or, you know, hours, that's okay. If it takes hours for my message to get across the network in general, if I'm communicating with somebody, not so much. Just about done. So, last thing I'll note is there's been a bunch of papers recently and books talking about group knowledge in social groups, like things like Facebook and stuff. In fact, there was a paper this morning, which I just added to my notes here because I went over to DALI, and there's some cool papers over there, but also over here, so things happen all simultaneously, that look at the interplay between you know, friendships and social influence. And I mentioned our notion of threshold groups. And as far as I know, nobody has really done anything with that, and I think this is very likely an untapped thing. The paper this morning didn't talk about threshold groups, but it was talking about threshold amounts of information and properties, and when you would this would apply to group friend formation, but also how when you would obtain a new property based on, you know, how your friends were going, and I think there's a potential for using the threshold groups for that. So, like epistemic logic in general, I would say our formal analysis and automated analysis of anonymity outside of voting has not followed its promise. And I think in so a question would be, could it continue and grow in its usefulness for voting protocols? There have been some, I didn't cite them, some significant analyses of voting protocols. And I also, it's an interesting question that somebody may or may not want to take up about tying the epistemic formalisms down to the sort of specifications that protocols usually get. Other open things, could we add temporal or dynamic logic to analyze the sort of anonymity security properties that we have identified for onion routing? And lastly, could maybe threshold groups be useful for looking at social notions of groups? And that's about all I had to say. So, thank you.